Maplestory the Novel, Season 1, Sacred Tears. Written by Tatsumari Korisuno. Chapter 2, Part 1. Searching.
Mother? What's wrong?
Reen groaned as she woke from her slumber. Once her eyes focused, she saw the black-cloaked figure gripping Ariel's wrist hard enough to make her hand begin to turn white. Reen turned to see her personal friend and guard in a heap of metal on the ground. Reen then realized the cloaked man was the same who had slaughtered Will.
No! Let her go!
Reen screamed, throwing the covers off and readying an attack spell, fear thick in her eyes. The sight of Will being run through so many times flashed through her mind, petrified the same would happen to her mother.
Reen, stop!
Instantly, Reen froze in place, looking down to see a dozen small spear-tipped chains pointed at her. The man's stare over his shoulder made Reen's face drain of color. Unable to run, unable to breathe.
Were you honestly going to break your promise to me?
Slow asked placidly as he turned back to Ariel. Questions burned in Reen's eyes.
You would use her for such a deed?
Ariel asked in return, making him smirk as he eased his grip on Ariel's wrist.
You and I both know what our contract says. Didn't you say this would be the best course of action?
Slow asked, brushing her long, battle-tangled red hair from her face with the backs of his fingers. Ariel tried to pull away, but he mirrored her perfectly, his pressing, soul-chilling presence making it hard to move.
Mother, what does he mean? What deal did you make?
Reen asked, fear settling into her heart when the sounds of battle raging within the temple began to draw her attention. A loud explosion shook the floor, making Reen run to the balcony. The sight below horrified her, seeing knights of black battling with the knights of the temple. Metal and blood stained the marble floor, the empty shells of the knights and corpses of the monks scattered everywhere. Increase power output! Dr. Long shouted over the roar of generators, the body he created straining in its shackles. There isn't any more power to give, called a scientist. The synapses will shred themselves if we don't give it more power, Dr. Long shouted, tapping madly on a typewriter-like keyboard. Bright blue light scrolling across the screen revealed the process happening as the computational machines worked. Generator 1 is overheating, another scientist called. We'll draw from the city's power grid. Rerouting power now, Dr. Long called, typing in the commands. Just as he was about to enact them, Maxis slammed his hand down on the emergency shutdown, cutting all power. Sparks showered the floor from the head of the body as the intricate wiring of the synthetic brain melted. Why did you do that? Dr. Long shouted, slamming his fist down on the desk and grabbing Maxis by the collar of his shirt, shaking him hard.
Sir, the power circuitry in the lab wouldn't have been able to withstand that kind of amperage. Generators 1 through 7 were overheating, the control circuits for the reaction were beginning to fail, and to top it all off, despite being performed with one of our strongest alchemic circles, the barrier created was beginning to bend.
Maxis shouted back, motioning towards the various components he mentioned.
Can you imagine the kind of destruction that would ensue if the circle collapsed and released all that energy?
Maxis further pressed, drawing Long's attention to parts of the circle that were deformed and discolored. Dr. Long looked to the barrier still in place as the energy within dissipated. Shoving Maxis aside, he leaned heavily on the table and sighed, resting his head against the safety glass in defeat. It took me months to create the synapses for its brain, he said softly.
I know, and I'm sorry it had to come to this, but ending thousands of lives isn't worth it,
answered Maxis. Behind them, Dane sat writing notes, studying the reactions of all the individuals involved with Dr. Long's project. He couldn't help but notice that when Dr. Long leaned against the glass, there was a brief wave of darkness around him. The study of this darkness Dane had felt as a child was still steadily growing more influential in the world. To Dane, it felt as if darkness briefly pulsed more strongly from Dr. Long than the world. What could this mean? Dane thought to himself, walking out of the Great Circle's control arena and back to his own house. For the past 5 years, he refined his understanding of this darkness and finally began to solidify a consistent way of detecting it. Opening his room's door greeted him with the rustle of papers and the smell of drying ink. Pulling his own journal from his pocket, he sat down at his desk and pored over the notes he had gathered over the previous half-decade. The darkness, he found, had always been there, even before he had felt it as a child. But this new development just might be the breakthrough he needed. He reached into a cabinet and pulled from it the first notebook he ever kept, reading through his notes. As he compared them, he began to see a pattern building. The darkness seemed to periodically rise in strength and add to the world. Coincidentally, these rises paralleled failed tests of a component in the lab.
June 5th, power core tested today. Connection failed. The darkness felt stronger around Dr. Long. June 10th, actuators for limbs tested. Test failed. Darkness feels slightly stronger around Dr. Long. Other scientists also have a rise in darkness. June 14th, second actuator test. Test failed. Darkness has increased, but only by a minuscule amount around Dr. Long.
His careful notes pointed to the fact that there was a swell of darkness when the scientist felt defeated. As more and more tests failed, he began to see other scientists previously unaffected begin exuding the same swells in darkness. When combined, the intensity of the darkness surrounding Magatia would increase as well. However, the darkness as a whole felt as if it had grown far more in the world than the amount he perceived in Magatia alone. Perhaps the answer lay beyond the walls of his city? His train of thought was broken when a soft knock came on the door. "Yes, come in," he called, closing his notes and turning to face the door as it opened.
Hi, Dane. I thought I'd find you here.
The golden-haired girl said, stepping through the door and closing it behind her. "Menodora, always a pleasure to see you," Dane answered, standing to greet her. "You cut your hair," grinned Dane, noticing that her blonde hair was shorter than in previous days, stopping just above her shoulders.
I just came from the barber's. Do you like it?
Dane nodded his approval, running his hand through her shorter locks. He had grown to like her lengthy hair, but this new length was styled well enough that he didn't mind.
Made any progress? I saw you while I was at the market and thought I'd check in.
She asked, her light blue eyes shining with questions. Dane dropped his gaze and turned back to his notes without saying anything. He and Menodora met during a meeting of all the highest leaders of Magatia to discuss the progression of projects and to present new ideas or theories. Dane at first passed her off as just another woman drawn to him because of his long white hair and striking eyes, something that brought most women to him, which would lead to the predictable questions of how they too could make their hair like his. In all honesty, even he hadn't the slightest idea how or why his hair was white and passed it off as saying he was born with it. But Menodora persisted after formally introducing herself and took a genuine interest in his work, questioning everything that he had researched up to that point. She, too, had noticed something wrong with the world and had heard of Dane's research. She sought him out in hopes that she could glean some small bit of insight from him. While their conversation was more on a surface level, her talk with Dane brought a better understanding of what she felt.
Well?
She asked, walking up behind him and placing her small hands on his arms, looking down at his notes while resting her chin on his shoulder. "So far, I have only found that the darkness is becoming more intense when a negative event occurs," Dane answered, turning the page and looking over even more notes.
Do you think it's only coming from Dr. Long? I mean, I would be disappointed if I was working on something like this. It does mean a lot to him,
she theorized. Dane shook his head and closed his book. "No, I've felt smaller rises in darkness of those around him as well," he answered, becoming lost in his thoughts while rubbing his chin.
Perhaps a small break would get you the answer. I brought your favorite, horned mushroom pie.
Menodora smiled, curling her hand and making a pie tin appear in her palm. Dane smiled, turning away from his desk as Menodora waved her free hand, creating a small picnic table scene in his room. "You've been practicing, I see," Dane said with an impressed tone, sitting down and setting out plates and utensils. Menodora had been taking some magical and alchemical lessons from Dane when he saw her learning by herself from a few old books.
This is the most elaborate I've been able to do so far.
Menodora replied shyly, sitting down when her concentration on the pie was lost and it fell from her grip. She tried to reach for it, but it slipped through her reach and into Dane's hand. She looked away as her cheeks flared bright red and put her hands in her lap. Nothing happened to Menodora. It's still safe, he chuckled, reaching for her hand.
That was the first spell I ever learned. I was hoping I would have a grip on that one by now. I really want to impress you,
Menodora said, looking away with a frustrated huff. You already have. Come, let's eat, Dane reassured, putting down the pie and beginning to cut it. Menodora smiled as her cheeks began to cool. When at last the food was eaten, a spark of inspiration drove Dane to gather his notes and look them over again. There had been times when the waves of darkness had been stronger. He also recorded that this darkness felt different somehow. Perhaps there isn't just one darkness. What if there are multiple kinds as the result of differing negative events?